Hey, I'm firearms attorney Gilbert Ambler, and we're back to talk about the executive order that Biden issued affecting the firearms industry and all of the nasty tricks and traps that I believe are contained within that order. Before we dive into this, if you have not yet hit that subscribe button, go ahead, hit subscribe for us, like this, comment, tell your friends. That way you and your friends can keep getting this pro-Second Amendment related content. All right, the executive order we're talking about was released on March 14th. That was yesterday. And what President Biden is discussing is several things. He starts off by the usual calls for unconstitutional bans on things like assault weapons, but then he dives into several specific requests, and we're not going to discuss all of them, but I want to direct your attention to a couple of these. The first specific request that we need to talk about is he demands that the Attorney General clarify who is engaged in the business and make sure that those who are engaged in the business of dealing firearms are running the appropriate background checks. Now, we assume that he's not talking about currently licensed federal firearms licensees, current FFLs, because we know that those folks are required to operate their business to run background checks. So presumably what he's talking about is he's talking about individuals in states that allow private sales, and he wants to clarify which of those individuals is required to obtain an FFL. And when I say clarify, it seems what he really means is expand. He wants to make sure that if you're selling guns privately, you're not allowed to do that, and you have to get an FFL. That way they are able to monitor your activity, okay? But this seems strange for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that the term engaged in the business is actually defined by statute in 18 U.S.C. 921A21. And what that says is it says that engaged in the business means someone who is importing, manufacturing, or dealing in firearms with the principal objective of obtaining profit or livelihood, okay? So if you're selling a firearm here and there on Gunbroker or at a gun show as a hobby, this probably doesn't apply to you. And yet, President Biden seems to want it to apply to you. And what that means is it means that the Attorney General and presumably the DOJ is likely going to start prosecuting more individuals who are selling a gun here or there as part of their hobby, and they're likely going to start prosecuting them alleging that they are really engaged in the business with the principal objective of obtaining profit, okay? But this is strange because it runs directly contrary to what we're seeing the Biden administration do with those who are actually applying to obtain an FFL. Because when you apply to obtain an FFL, the process is governed by 18 U.S.C. 923. And 18 U.S.C. 923 says in order to obtain an FFL, you need to meet several requirements. Number one, you need to actually desire to engage in the business. Number two, you've got to be at least 21 years of age. Number three, you cannot be a prohibited person. You have to be legally eligible to possess firearms. Number four, you cannot have willfully violated the act. Number five, you cannot willfully fail to disclose material information in connection with your application. We're going to come back to that one. I want you to remember that one. Number six, you have to have premises within the state where you want to conduct business from which your business will be run. And number seven, you must certify that within 30 days of receiving an FFL, you will be compliant with federal, state, and local laws. Let's come back to that one I drew your attention to a second ago, which is willfully fails to disclose material information in connection with your application. This one is the one that in our experience we are seeing the ATF use more and more frequently to deny people FFLs, in part, in my opinion, because it's so difficult to disprove. Because if they're saying you failed to disclose something in connection with your application, for us to disprove that, it's like trying to disprove a negative. How are we supposed to prove that you did disclose something that doesn't exist in the first place? Because the ATF can essentially say you failed to disclose some business relationship, and if that business relationship doesn't exist, how do you disprove that negative? Compounding this problem is that when you are denied an FFL, the decision to deny it is made by the Director of Industry Operations, and guess who your first appeal was before? The Director of Industry Operations. So you can guess how well that's likely to go. And if you get denied again there, your next step is an appeal to federal court, which is a very costly process. So we're seeing more and more people who apply to get their FFLs actually get denied. This seems directly at odds with Biden trying to say that everyone who's selling guns needs to have an FFL. Why would this be? Well, I think the theory is this. If you're selling guns privately You then go try to get an FFL, you get denied the FFL, and then you're caught selling guns again in the future, you can absolutely bet that your attempt and denial to obtain the FFL is going to be used against you. And if you do obtain the FFL, you're going to be subject to the Biden administration's zero tolerance policies when it comes to FFLs. What does that mean? It means your FFL could be revoked for even minor paperwork, minor clerical errors might be enough for them to revoke your FFL, alleging that you committed a willful violation. And if your FFL is revoked, you had to keep the records of everyone who you sold a gun to. All of those records are going to go to the ATF, which means whether they get them today, tomorrow, or 20 years from now when you go out of business, the ATF is going to get the records of every single firearm that you sold, which of course is very, very different than if you were selling them privately without an FFL in a state that allowed you to do so. So that's the first nasty trick or trap that I think that the Biden administration laid with this executive order. The second thing we need to talk about is the encouragement for states to advertise that they have red flag laws. 19 states currently have red flag laws. The Biden administration wants those states to advertise that they have them so that more people use them. In essence, what the Biden administration wants people to do is start tattling on their neighbors so that their neighbors get their guns removed. And I can think back through history about other regimes that encouraged people to tattle on their neighbors, and history has not looked kindly on those regimes. So you think about that for just a minute, and I think you'll know who I'm talking about. Third thing that the Biden administration did that I think is important with this executive action is they encouraged further harassment of the firearms industry in two different ways. The first thing they did is they want the ATF to release inspection compliance results to the public. That way the public can harass those gun stores. Even if it's not enough that they get revoked, if they have little issues, they can expect the public to all know about those little issues with their paperwork. The second thing that they're doing, the Biden administration is doing, is encouraging the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to get involved in investigating the way that firearms are advertised. This is reminiscent of what they did to the cigarette industry and how the FTC came after the cigarette industry and really crippled the cigarette industry. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's a tactic that we expect to be applied to the firearms industry in the future. And then the final thing that I think is really, really dangerous is the Biden administration is urging Congress to reevaluate and to take another look at the Federal Undetectable Firearms Act. Now, this act passed in 1988 says that firearms have to be detectable by a metal detector, but it exempts, under current law, exempts the frames or receivers of such weapons. What does that mean? It means a polymer frame or receiver for something like a Glock that is currently a firearm under the law is not subject to the Undetectable Firearms Act, because although a metal detector might not pick up on it, it's a frame or receiver alone, and therefore the act doesn't apply to it in that manner. If, however, Congress rewrites this, they could rewrite it to say that any firearm, including the frame or receiver that is not detectable by a metal detector, is unlawful. And if they do that, it would outlaw things like polymer Glock frames. So you could see the potential for abuse if they rewrite this law, and that's why I'm concerned when the Biden administration is telling Congress to rewrite this. If you enjoyed this content, if you like what we talked about, hit that subscribe button for us, tell your friends, like, share. Until next time.